want to ask you about J.K. Rowling. One of our writers once wrote that J.K. Rowling has taken the TERF movement too far and has become quite malicious.
I want us to turn to the case of Sandy Peggy, a nurse, and Beth Upton, a trans doctor. So, for those who may not have been following the case, Miss Peggy objected to having to share the changing room at Victoria Hospital, which is part of NHS Fife, with Dr. Upton, a trans woman. Sandy Peggy was then suspended. She claims her treatment amounted to unlawful harassment under the Equality Act, and so Sandy Peggy took NHS Fife, and indeed Dr. Upton, to tribunal. Really very easy, is it not, to draw the line between your support for Nicola Sturgeon's gender recognition reform bill and this exact situation.
This whole bill is a disaster for employers and needs to be scrapped.
And because the Equality and Human Rights Commission is saying that if the way this bill could be interpreted, if you start giving your view on the transgender issue, for instance, someone can say, that's out of order.
Yeah.
Conversation over.
Your words offend me.
Exactly.
In my workplace, and therefore...
And the publican then may be required to end the conversation.
Oh, I hate
them out,
it.
or throw them out the pub.
I mean, it really is 1984. We are living it now, isn't it? It's newspeak.
Sandy Peggy, an NHS nurse for 30 years, spoke up for her sex-based rights in her workplace because she did not want to share a changing facility with a biological male. But in doing so, she's being treated as the perpetrator, not the victim.
What would you do if you had £1 billion? Solve world hunger, perhaps? Provide accommodation, maybe, for everyone without a home across the entire planet? Pay for solar panels for half the world to tackle climate change borderline overnight? There are, I'm sure, for each of us, about 100 things we could think to do with such a ridiculous amount of money. So why is it that actual billionaires seem to only want to use their vast fortunes to attack minorities, buy governments, go to space with William Shatner, and basically do anything but actually help a single person with all of that money they got from exploiting the lower classes and all their employees? So, for example, Patient Zero of the fungal zombie virus that will surely doom us all to live in the Last of Us universe, which, given Neil Druckmann's politics, might as well be a fate worse than death. Professional mold sniffer, legendary racist name generator, and patron saint of blue checkmarks, jangling keys Rowling, who has, over the past few years, demonstrated for all the people that looked up to her and her work growing up that there is no such thing as a good billionaire. By slowly transforming into a mirror universe Dolores Umbridge, complete with the obsession with violently punishing children for the crime of being true to themselves, and using her vast fortune that she made from putting smiles on kids' faces to wage a hate campaign against queer Brits, endorsing, funding, and platforming fascists, and in the latest development in her long road to reputational ruin, calling for the sacking of an entire NHS health board. Never mind the fact that she could give a small part of her fortune to fund the NHS itself, at least for a while, which would be a much better use of her money and her time, but no. There can be no salvation for the people of Britain at the hands of Miss Jimmy Kimmel Rowling, only hardship and punishment for the crime of allowing trans people to live and work like regular human beings. An unforgivable offence, if we're being honest.
It really is 1984. We are living it now, isn't it? It's newspeak.
At this point, she might as well fund her own trans-only prison. It's the natural endpoint of this whole process, and at least that'd keep her busy enough to pull her off Twitter. At least that is until the new HBO Harry Potter series comes out, which is certainly a choice for everyone involved. And that's not even mentioning the implications of casting a black man as Snape, which turns the story about Harry's dad being a bully and a prick into him being a fantasy Klansman. But I'm sure that this won't cause any pushback at all. After all, it's not like this is a series by a fascist whose fascism has only come to the fore and grown more and more bold in recent years, right? Right. Well, now that we're sure that nothing bad will ever come out of that, let me talk to you about this whole Rowling demanding a purge of healthcare workers thing. Because I spent a good 2 months posting almost exclusively about American fascism.
I'm gonna come.
And it's about time we got back to the good old boys across the pond. Britain, where the far right is rising in the form of Nigel Farage and Reform UK, where every major party is trying to stave this off by doing everything these people want, and thus paving the way for their now apparently inevitable victory. No one can afford anything, we can only ever do austerity forever and never with no breaks, and also the people you should blame for this, according to the politicians and the media, are Muslims, trans people, and statistically probably also Owen Jones. I missed this particularly Anglo sense of impending doom. Doom hits different on the continent, whereas British doom, it has a certain eldritch post-industrial musk to it. Makes you proud to be British.
All I want's proper bloody milk, not left-wing options.
The thing that always gets me about the Conservative urge to bash the NHS is that the NHS is one of the few things that most Brits, one, agree on, and two, are actually passionate about. As a government institution, it's about on par with going for a cheeky pint with the lads, or the concept of banter. So why would an already incredibly successful white woman, with the power and influence of a medium-sized country, choose to attack an institution that British people love almost as much as they love drinking tea and colonialism? Well, obviously, the answer to that is because she hates trans people, but you all knew that already. The real question is, how did her hatred for trans people lead her to back such a ridiculous measure? Well, that's what I, Bridget Empire, science and culture correspondent for only the Daily Bloody Telegraph, am here to talk about today. And as a representative and proud employee of the only newspaper in Britain entirely staffed with people one bad gust of wind away from rigor mortis, it is my duty, nay, my privilege, to say to the NHS Fife Health Board that the Daily Telegraph has your back. And all it'll cost you to receive our aid is the immortal soul of each of your firstborn children. Which, to be honest, is a better deal than the one the wizard lady is pushing for.
It's newspeak.
So, what happened here? Well, some of this depends on where you read about this story, by which I mean many news articles omitted key details that made it clear why the NHS in Fife stood where it did, and why, even if they hated trans people, they would have been out of their minds to side with the rabid transphobe in this case, who Rowling, the British press, and after some cajoling, pretty much every politician in Scotland besides the Scottish Greens are obviously going to bat for. Hit it, Cilla Black. So let's start this off with the way many of us will have initially heard about it, because it was framed around Jaffa Cake Rowling. Not because she's directly involved in this case, but because she's one of the most influential people in the country, and she very loudly picked a side, even to extreme ends. And I mean extreme ends even for her, because let's be honest, she'd been off the deep end at least since the pandemic. So the Scottish Daily Express, a very cool and normal newspaper, wrote this lovely little article titled, "J.K. Rowling backs call for entire NHS Fife board to be sacked over trans doctor scandal." And, well, yes, she has. Now, that might sound extreme, because it is. But the British press, especially the British press south of Hadrian's Wall, is extremely insistent that she's in the right for this. And not just because it means an excuse to attack the NHS, without obviously giving away that they're more conservative than Margaret Thatcher at a Trump rally.
Me, a moderate and a liberal.
But because for this story to be believable, you need to maintain a level of outrage at the trans person in dispute with her cis colleague in the Fife NHS to not question any of the facts or look into it any further. For example, might it have been a case that the transphobe getting the British press hero treatment endangered her patients? Yes, it might. Might her transphobia have put patients at risk? Yes. Yes, it might. But you wouldn't know that by listening to J.K. Rowling's tirade on social media, or from the output of, say, the Daily Telegraph, no relation to my esteemed employers, of course, who have written multiple articles about this saga that are not exactly forthcoming about these genuinely very pressing details. Or even worse, the people we're about to quote from, the Scottish Daily Express. J.K. Rowling has backed calls for the entire NHS Fife Health Board to be sacked after it vilified a nurse who objected to a male doctor being allowed to use a changing room with her. Sandy Peggy took NHS Fife and Dr. Beth Upton to an employment tribunal after being suspended following an incident on Christmas Eve 2023 in the female changing rooms. She lodged a complaint of sexual harassment or harassment related to a protected belief under Section 26 of the Equality Act 2010 regarding 3 incidents when they shared a changing room. Indirect harassment, victimization, and whistleblowing. That came after she was suspended in January 2024 following Dr. Upton making an allegation of bullying and harassment. Miss Peggy described how she became distressed after Dr. Upton undressed in front of her, despite him being a biological man. He has repeatedly insisted he's in fact a woman, and was accused of lying about other incidents in order to get the veteran nurse sacked from the job. The Harry Potter author, Batcalls, reposted a post on X, this is horribly written, reposting a post on X by writer Ewan McCollum, who called for the Scottish Government to sack the board, writing, "If Scotland had a halfway competent health secretary, he'd get rid of every last one of these people." He reshared a post by another journalist, Gethin Chamberlain, detailing who was on the health board. His post said, "This is the board of NHS Fife, which has vilified a nurse who objected to a male doctor being allowed to use a changing room with her. Sandy Peggy was condemned on the say-so of Dr. Beth Upton before she even had the opportunity to respond. The board failed to prevent this." Later, Rowling retweeted another comment from McCollum, where he said, "The best outcome from John Swinney is the complete humiliation of NHS Fife. This will give him the cover he needs, because he is a coward, to finally say enough's enough and start stripping this nonsense from every public body in Scotland." You might notice that this paints Dr. Upton, or as the Scottish Daily Express calls her in a different article, transgender Dr. Beth Upton, in a pretty bad light. It doesn't mention the ill treatment she faced at the hands of her colleague, Miss Peggy, who filed the employment tribunal, or the reasons why Miss Peggy was fired. Instead, this is framed from the perspective of trying to make this trans doctor look malicious, like she was causing trouble in the workplace and Miss Peggy was a victim. Now, if she's a victim of getting changed in a changing room with Dr. Upton, personally I think that's kind of silly. I mean, I myself prefer to change in cubicles. I don't want people perceiving me, lest they turn to stone, and I'm finally exposed as a Gorgon in a human skin suit, but that's just me. If Miss Peggy was truly horrified about getting changed in the same area as a trans woman, that's going to make it hard for them to work together, but it's not something that people usually get fired for being against. Even if I do suspect that if you're so loud about it you file an employment tribunal, you're probably an asshole. But lots of bigots work with normal people all the time without it getting this far. So you might be asking, what have they left out of this story? Well, according to the Telegraph, Sandy Peggy was let go after misgendering Dr. Upton. Now, that's probably not the whole story, but it's obviously intentionally shitty behaviour intended to upset someone, and again, will make you a pain in the arse to work with. Now, the Scottish Daily Express obviously couldn't give less of a shit about misgendering, because it misgenders Dr. Upton in pretty much every article it's written about her. In fact, the article in which Upton is referred to as transgender Dr. Beth Upton by the Scottish Daily Express misgenders her throughout the article. So it's not exactly hard to see where this newspaper's bias lies. Even the Torygraph, as cruel and awful as it is, has a little more tact than that. If only because that tact gives them cover to be awful and bigoted in more nefarious and underhanded means. Which is basically the entire MO of the English press. So this probably isn't an entirely fair and or balanced recollection of the situation. So let's go to one of the other British outlets famous for rabid and violent transphobia, which nevertheless on occasion manages to actually do the odd bit of decent journalism. The pride and joy of the British media, the BBC, who have a whole article about exactly why Sandy Peggy was fired, which is, of course, the whole reason the employment tribunal is happening to start with, and therefore, something that you would think would have been incredibly important to mention in the articles by the Scottish Daily Express and the Telegraph, where they try to act like they're doing genuine coverage of this issue, despite refusing to make it clear what the problem was that caused this incident in the first place. Was it the transgender doctor getting changed in front of a colleague that got the cis colleague fired? Was it constant misgendering by the cis colleague that got the transgender doctor fired? Well, let's ask the person that did said firing, by way of the article, Manager Defends Suspension of Trans Row Nurse. A nurse manager has told an employment tribunal she felt it was the best decision at the time to suspend an emergency department nurse to ensure patient safety. Nurse Sandy Peggy took NHS Fife and Dr. Beth Upton to tribunal after she was suspended over an incident in the female changing room in Victoria Hospital, Kirkcaldy. Miss Peggy objected to having to share the changing room with Dr. Upton, a trans woman, and claims her treatment amounted to unlawful harassment under the Equality Act. Clinical nurse manager Esther Davidson told the tribunal the decision to suspend Miss Peggy was to protect both Sandy, Beth, and the patients. Miss Davidson initially led an investigation after Dr. Upton made a complaint of bullying and harassment against Miss Peggy, but was removed 2 months later after it was recognised she should be a witness in the tribunal. Miss Peggy's lawyer, Naomi Cunningham, quizzed the nurse manager on the reason for Miss Peggy's suspension. I felt they were at risk of further interaction and perhaps some professional behaviour, she said. Miss Davison said that Dr. Upton's allegation that Miss Peggy would leave the resuscitation area when the medic came in was a patient safety issue. The nurse manager said the decision was to suspend an emergency department nurse in what was a pressed department that was not an easy one. She said she had reiterated to colleagues that suspension is a last resort and not a first. Miss Peggy's lawyer suggested that a much less drastic and economical option would mean to change the medics' rotas to ensure they were not on shift together, and asked Dr. Upton to get changed in a single occupancy changing room. Miss Davison said this was not an option due to the shifts being worked out 6 weeks in advance. She had also been advised by NHS Fife's Equality and Diversity Department she was not permitted to exclude transgender females from the changing rooms. Miss Davidson said the Christmas Eve changing room incident had been the reason for the complaint, and allegations of Miss Peggy ignoring Dr. Upton while discussing a patient were brought up during the investigation. The lawyer put it to Esther Davidson that if the allegations about patient safety concerns were true, then it was seriously remiss of Dr. Upton to not have reported them at the time. She replied she would have expected the doctor to report to the clinical supervisor, but that Dr. Upton had stayed in the cubicle, and at that point there was no detriment to the patient. So this paints an entirely different picture. If you just learned this story from following J.K. Rowling or from the right-wing press, you would have heard that this was the story of a trans woman intruding on her colleague in the women's changing room and intimidating her, and after facing backlash, getting her fired. But even the BBC completely runs with a different narrative on this, because they are staffed by some actual journalists, even though I should remind all of you that if you are beginning to feel like the BBC might have a pro-trans bias, that this is the outlet which, in its oh-so-objective wisdom, used as a source for their awful journalism about lesbians feeling pressure to have sex with some trans women, as they said, and admitted who called for trans women and our allies to be lit, and a Twitter poll from a transphobic hate group. So, according to the manager who oversaw the firing of Sandy Peggy, her feud with Dr. Upton was so bad that she would literally walk out of the resuscitation area if she saw Dr. Upton there. This is a woman working as an emergency room nurse, and she would endanger her patients to avoid being in the same space as a trans colleague. This is a pretty good reason to fire someone. If someone is unreliable in an emergency department, if their petty grievances are becoming dangerous to patients, well then they're completely unfit for their job. Even if we ignore the patient safety issues and just focus on the issue of changing rooms, trans women are in more danger in male changing rooms than trans women are a danger to cis women in women's changing rooms. Because trans women are just not a danger to cis women in women's changing rooms, outside of the fantasies of J.K. Rowling and apparently Miss Peggy. That's just a fact. Although for me, the idea of gendered changing rooms is kind of silly anyway. I'm sure most of us would be much happier with just cubicles. Then no one has to see anyone else, and we can get a little privacy and, let the snakes in our hair come up for air every once in a while, instead of worrying about some asshole Greek holding a mirror and putting an end to my reign of terror upon the people of the Aegean. But if you're in a cubicle, then what's the issue? So we have allegations of bullying, constant misgendering, and walking out on emergency room patients. Yeah, that doesn't sound like the kind of behaviour that's fit for an emergency room. The part of our health system that most needs people on it. Most needs people to be able to put aside their differences and work together in a timely and efficient fashion. Because, it's an emergency. People can die. I doubt many people would be sympathetic if they found out their loved one passed away because their nurse walked out on them, rather than be within 3 feet of a transgender woman. And the fact that this is now being amplified by the most infamous writer in the country is an issue so terrible that the entire board of the Fife NHS should be removed? That's beyond bananas. In fact, in another BBC article, Dr. Upton outlines how, after being bullied and harassed by Sandy Peggy last time she used the changing room, she decided to stand up for herself and face this hostility head on. But upon entering the changing room, saw Miss Peggy and left. So clearly, Dr. Upton isn't exactly insisting upon sharing the changing room with her. Quite the opposite. And obviously, who wants to be screamed at when they're just trying to get changed? I mean, what do these people think changing rooms are for? The way transos talk about these places makes me think they've genuinely never seen a changing room in their life. They talk like every women's changing room is some mythical den of femininity, where everyone sniffs sweet perfumes and sits on soft cushions, is gushing with period blood at all times, and is simultaneously doing strange rituals of sisterhood, and that trans women coming into changing rooms would do what I assume they also assume men do, even though no one does this, trans women or otherwise, and run around the changing room swinging around their cock like it's a helicopter. People just want to get on with it. No one wants to go to a changing room. It's a miserable place, but it's a necessary one. Just like a bathroom. People go there to do what they have to do and get out of there. And most of the time there are cubicles, so even then that is not a concern. What are you afraid of? Do you have X-ray vision? How does someone being in a cubicle next to you concern you in any way? And quite contrary to the way Sandy Peggy tells the story of encountering Dr. Upton in the changing room, where she insists she was intimidated by her presence, Dr. Upton messaged her line manager afterwards saying, "I don't feel safe using the changing rooms when she's there," and then contacted the British Medical Association about the incident. So it must have been pretty fucking bad to get to that point. In fact, she had previously expressed fear to her lawyer about using the changing rooms again. So rather than Miss Peggy playing in any way the victim role in this scenario, she was apparently a bully who endangered her patients and actively scared a practicing doctor in an emergency department to the point where she just refused to use the changing room out of fear that she'd get screamed at. And this is an emergency department of which Miss Peggy cared so little that she would walk out on people in desperate need of medical attention. That is not the behaviour of someone who cares about their patients or even just doing their job, and doing their job is saving patients, so that does matter. That seems a pretty cut and dry case for firing someone in that situation. Honestly, it's embarrassing that the press has tried to cover it in any other way. Never mind the likes of Rowling acting like this is quarter of root and branch purge of a city's entire health board. Speaking of, the health secretary for the Scottish National Party was questioned about this incident after J.K. Rowling boosted claims that he should grow a spine and sack their health board's leadership over its scandalous treatment of a nurse who, we have already covered, was endangering her patients and bullying her colleagues, and being the cowardly centrist almost everyone in the SNP and Scottish Labour are, well, the health secretary gave a standard non-answer.
Health Secretary J.K. Rowling's backed calls for you to, quote, grow a spine and sack the leadership of NHS Fife. Will you grow a spine and do exactly that?
I think the process has got to be respected, and both in terms of any disciplinary process that there may be, and indeed the employment tribunal, and obviously we'll take considerations off the back of that, and I've got no further comment to make.
Do you have confidence in the leadership of NHS Fife?
Of course I do.
And forgive me if I can't be happy about a British politician not for once just completely taking the side of Rowling here, given that one of the biggest transphobes in the country is currently second in command of the SNP, even after having one of the most disastrous leadership campaigns I've ever witnessed. And I saw Jess Phillips bid to become Labour leader, so you know it's bad.
Marriage being between a man and a woman, that is what I practice. But I will not roll back on any rights that already exist in Scotland.
If you were about at the time where you were able to legislate on this, that's been and gone now, but you would have voted against that then because of your beliefs.
I would have.
We need people to genuinely back the right side of these issues. Even people who are ambivalent on trans people can look at what actually happened and see very clearly who was in the wrong. And yet, even with this, the best we can get is non-committal murmurings about following the rules and letting the law play out. Even as major politicians and celebrities push the narrative that because a trans person was involved in this case, that they must have been a malevolent demon sent to corrupt the hearts of innocent women, rather than a victim of bullying by someone who was genuinely so transphobic that she was endangering the lives of her patients. But the problem is actually getting them to read those facts, when the stories they are being bombarded with about this incident all the time are as batched as this one by arch-transphobe Suzanne Moore in the Daily Telegraph, titled, "Why would any woman work for the NHS after this nurse's experience?" And just in case you doubted Suzanne's stance, Sandy Peggy's failure to stop a trans doctor sharing a changing room with her proves that service is no longer a safe space for women. After which I assume the next step Rowling will be pushing for is for the entire NHS to be abolished. And wouldn't that be convenient for someone who claims to not be a conservative?
Me, a moderate and a liberal.
Every story about trans people in the British press is more proof that we are living in a post-truth world when it comes to groups that are acceptable to denigrate. You can say any old shit you want about trans people or Muslims or travellers, and some asshole in a newspaper editor's office will happily publish it. But this is an objectively false framing of how this happened. Is it any wonder that mainstream newspapers aren't getting the readership they used to? And headline after headline of shit like this. Completely false smear campaigns whose only purpose is to use any and every opportunity to bash trans people is how you get to a place where people react to this story like J.K. Rowling did. As if the world is such an evil and awful place, thanks to these arch-villains we call trans people, that the only legitimate response to the threat of a trans person existing in public is to tear down every system that doesn't actively punish them for existing. If Rowling had her way, the moment you came out as trans at work, you'd be fired. As if that's not already a problem for us. And because we will never go away, her rampage and her indignity will never end. unless someone finally changes her mind. The best we can hope for right now is that enough people realise she's far off the deep end that people stop listening to her. And that has happened to large swaths of the population, but as long as the British press keep treating every retweet of hers as an important interjection from one of the greatest minds in British literature, and something that should be put to every politician and treated as expert testimony no matter what it's about, well, that's gonna continue to be a problem. At least this time, the NHS in Fife seems to be actually standing with the people who didn't endanger patients. And even seeing the British press twist this story in real time before my eyes, it does feel like it's losing a lot of its persuasive power, if not slowing down entirely. Those BBC articles genuinely surprised me. People's appetite for transphobia, I genuinely believe, is waning. The British press's appetite, well, that might take a little more time to die down, but it's been a decade of this at this point. And I think we're reaching the point where it's the boy who cried wolf. For 10 years, we've been hearing that the transgender menace is out of control, and yet nothing has happened except for us being badly treated. I think most people can see at this point that we're not a clear and present danger to people. I mean, more than they did so before, when it was also very obvious. On a related note, honestly, these days, J.K. Rowling's reputation is a shadow of what it once was. She is less and less seen as a reliable voice on these issues. Thank fucking God. I only hope that people are smart enough to not let an HBO adaptation of Harry Potter tickle their nostalgia bone enough that they forget all of this, and try and forgive her for her part in fueling one of the most persistent and maddening culture wars of recent years. I mean, honestly, do people even want another adaptation? The movies already exist, and even then, it's a miracle they even came out as much as they did. There were 8 of them, and even then, only The Prisoner of Azkaban was kind of a banger. The rest were, just okay. We've had like 2 Dune movies since then, and none of Rowling's works have the brass balls to have giant sandworms that shit the ability to travel faster than light and make you the space drunk that does unlimited war crimes. That's innovation. Until she does, I won't be watching that garbage. And you shouldn't either. Watch something else. Like this channel, when I come back. Thanks for watching.
Loud the winds howl, loud the waves roar, thunderclaps rend to the air. Baffled our foes, stand by the shore, follow they will not dare. Speed by boat like a bird on the wing, onward the sailors cry. Carry the lad who's born to be king over the sea to sky. Though the waves leap, so shall ye sleep. Ocean's a royal bed. Dropped in the deep, Flora will keep watch by a weary head.
Hey, thank you for watching this video all the way to the end. If you liked it, give it a like, leave a comment, share it with your friends, tell everyone in the world, and throw money at me like I'm a stripper. Oh, J.K. Rowling will not like that one. Well, I've said it now. I'm not going to delete it. So if you want to, you can give me donations on Coffee or PayPal. Links below as always. Or sign up to my Patreon or YouTube memberships. We get early videos, access to the members-only Discord, my Nintendo Switch friend code. That was a tongue twister. And exclusive content, such as interviews I did fucking forever ago with Princess Weeks and Rosencrux and Jessie Gender. I should get more of those out for you guys. In addition to all of that good stuff, you'll also, if you sign up, you'll get your name read out at the end of each video, just like these lovely people. Lee Wilkins, George Geddes, Kira B, No Sparkling Heart, Corey, Matt J, Mightier Than the Sword, Carolyn, Imogen Q, Luciana Frias Andrade, Adam, Harry, Ndog191, Cav, Quesadilla Tortilla Azul, Liron, Adam Lees, Daniel Nevels, no, not that Paul, MB, Madeline Aguirre, Ben Murphy, Lex Phoenix, Enter Clisitz, Mira D, Jade Senior, Boa Ea, James W. Marvin, or Foron Gill, Bob the Builder, 5445554, Deborah Laboon, Vegas, Zillas Athenaeum, Vince Whitaker, Amelia Lissette, Jason Haig, Frank McManus, Susan Foster, Helen Real, Sierra Whiskey, Ernest Tria, Ali Catgill, John N, Lloyd Luciente, Jameson Cribbett, Shield Naden, Robin Podolsky, Turtle Tune, Casual Observer, Manta Ray, Courtney Burnham, Sleepy Slug, Philippa Tabrogga, Soma Piglet, Brain Douche, Artie Wolf, Greg Noble, Deanna McMillan, Caroline Regalado, Alexandra Lilly, Howard Lott, Nerania Scarjan, and Joey Cobalt. Thank you all for your patronage, and see you next time. Why was that French? Patronage.